All right. Hi, everyone. I think we can get started since it's now right on the hour. So, my name is Devin, and I'll be moderating today's event alongside Dr. Namunji Matale, One Day Africa's communication lead. So, the African continent has lagged behind in scientific and medical research. This is due to a number of complex factors, which vary in their approachability as topics in their own right and also in their difficulty to address. But at One Day Africa, we see a lack of resources and, in particular, funding as one of the primary factors responsible for this lag. And thus, we decided to make it our first topic that we discuss with an eye towards creating a sustainable system of medical research on the continent. COVID-19 was also a stark reminder that sustainability and self-sufficiency will go a long way in ensuring that African scientists and researchers can create solutions without relying on external governments or organizations. We acknowledge that discussing today's topic is very delicate, and as with all questions of governance and finance, there are a vast majority of considerations. However, there are many potential benefits of increasing African medical and scientific research funding. One of the primary ones is that locally funded research will be far more tailored towards the needs of African communities and will solve a lot more African-centric problems. With that said, there are also certainly benefits towards international collaboration, and in any African-centric research system, it should be developed with the global medical community in mind. This should not be a problem, though, as a self-sufficient African medical community can only stand to benefit the rest of the world. These are just some of the points of consideration, and we aim to discuss a lot more of them tonight. Fortunately, we are joined by an illustrious panel with many years of experience on these topics. We hope to foster a valuable conversation to help policy members and researchers in Africa find ways to encourage the allocation of funding for scientific and medical research in Africa. If anyone would like to ask questions during this discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screens, and you can begin to start asking those questions whenever you have them or whenever they come available. With all that being said, I'll now hand over to my co-moderator, Namunji, to introduce the panel. Thanks, Namunji.
Thank you so much for that preamble, Devon, and good evening, everyone, or depending on where you're joining us from, good morning or good afternoon. I have the rare privilege of introducing our wonderful panel for this evening. First up, we have Professor Godfrey Biemba. Professor Godfrey Biemba is the Director and CEO for the National Health Research Authority in Zambia. He holds several other positions, which include, but aren't limited to, Adjunct Research Assistant Professor at Boston University School of Public Health in the US, Honorary Associate Professor of Global Health at Lusaka Apex Medical University, Associate Professor of Public Health at University of Barotseland, Guest Lecturer in Health Systems Research at Levi Mwanawasa Medical University, and several other posts. He is a medical doctor and public health specialist with training in clinical research, ethics, health systems, and 36 whole years of experience in the health sector as a medical practitioner, a researcher, capacity builder, and health manager. Professor Biemba has 100 publications, actually over 100, if you correct me, over 100 publications, out of which 72 are peer-reviewed articles. As of June 16th this year, he had achieved a ResearchGate publication score of 32.94, which is higher than 92.5% of all ResearchGate member scores. His ResearchGate H index, excluding self-citations, by the way, was 21. In a nutshell, he has an excellent scientific reputation based on his contributions to ResearchGate in terms of published and unpublished articles and research projects, citations, questions, and answers. We're glad to have you on the panel, Professor Biemba. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Namunji.
Alrighty. Our next panelist is Dr. Richard Gordon, who is currently the Director of International Business Development at the South African Medical Research Council. Anyone that knows what One Day Africa is all about knows that we get very excited when we hear about vaccine development. On that front, Dr. Richard previously was the Executive Director of the Grants, Innovation and Product Development Group at the South African Medical Research Council, which oversaw the majority of grant funding and international programs seeking to develop new drugs, vaccines, and medical devices for diseases in Africa. Dr. Richard completed his PhD at the University of Cape Town and his postdoctoral fellowship at University of Cambridge. He is currently one of the drivers of the mRNA hub under the newly awarded WHO program. He has held a number of international positions and specializes in establishing innovation-based international research partnerships with funders, international partners, and the private. Dr. Richard currently represents South Africa on the EU-led joint program for antimicrobial resistance, consisting of 29 whole countries. He is a consultant to Medicines for Malaria Venture and NAT's SA Vaccine Production Campus. He also enjoys mentoring young innovators at Stellenbosch University Launch Lab. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel, Dr. Gordon.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Okay. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Abel Wilson Walekwa. Mr. Abel is the public health specialist and PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. He holds a master's degree of public health from Mbarara University of Science and Technology in Uganda, a postgrad training in health services management, a bachelor's degree in environmental health science from Makerere University. He is currently serving as a senior epidemiologist at the Science, Technology and Innovation Secretariat under the Office of the President in Uganda since March 2020. Mr. Walekwa has particular interest in control and management of epidemics arising from infectious disease. His daily role entails organizing and coordinating scientific funding for drugs and vaccine development work in Uganda. He has previously won 4 research grants since 2019, with the most recent fellowship grant won at the University of Cambridge and University of Nairobi, worth $6,000 for Rift Valley fever disease modeling in Uganda. He believes the habit of writing and competing internationally among scientists makes them slaves, yet pursuing the research agenda set by funders, which really isn't sustainable. In this panel discussion, he brings experience in funding researchers in Uganda and how they are making progress. He asserts that for sustainable funding for medical research in Africa, African governments must prove research fundings as a clear research agenda. Welcome, Mr. Walekwa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, without further ado, we will jump right into our agenda for the evening if everyone is on board. So I have a very, very important and cardinal question for our panelists. In your own words, kindly describe what you feel or how you would define sustainable funding for medical research. We can start with Professor Biemba.
Thank you so much, Namunji, and thank you for the viewers and listeners. It's a privilege for me to start this very important discussion, which really has been at the heart of my profession, I'll say, as a researcher, because it's a concern for everyone who is a researcher. What is sustainable funding for medical research? I could paraphrase that. What is sustainable research funding? To me, is the availability of funds for priority research on a continuing basis. There are key words that I'm emphasizing here. One is availability. 2 is priority research. 3 is a continuing basis. It means having funds that are available most of the time to fund national research budget. And now, again, I emphasize, there has to be some national research budget. Number 3, for me, I look at sustainable research funding as predictable, again, keyword, predictable financing for research. To me, and you might probably disagree with me on this note, for me, sustainable research funding is not the same as self-sufficiency in research funds. To me, it's not the same. And I'm sure we could interact on that score, but let me stop here for a while. I think that is my view of what sustainable research funding is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and wholesome answer. Mr. Walekwa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the kind introduction, but also greetings to the audience that have joined us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where they are joining from. Just to add to what my colleague has stated, sustainable funding, we must bring the concept of accessibility, because these funds could be there, could be prioritized, for example, but the researchers and the scientists and the innovators must be able to access these funds at the time when they need them. The other aspect for sustainable funding is the aspect of it coming back. You know, I want to bring a very important point here that yes, we can give this money to research Abel to go and investigate and also do ABCDXYZ. But for us to make it sustainable, we need to begin having that money coming back in terms of product marketing, in terms of procurement of the products we have got from this investment. That is how we will make it sustainable. Because if we just keep giving this researcher Abel money and he keeps going, and the other researcher Wilson also comes and goes, the basket will get finished. So it won't be sustainable. I want to stop at that.
Thank you. So far we've spoken to the idea of self-sufficiency not being the same as sustainability, as well as accessibility for funding. Dr. Richard, we'd like to hear from your perspective what your definition would be.
So thank you very much, and very nice to meet the audience. I think both panelists have illustrated the two types of buckets of funding, but I think if you look at it in silos in that direction, if you cut it across in a 90-degree direction, they tend to come from different sources. So the initial funding that we talk about as sustainable funding tends to come from governments, where they provide a 5 or 10-year sustainable funding for entities to get up and running, and those typically come from governments. You don't typically get international funders funding that kind of fund of thing. So that is really important types of sustainable funding to help groups get up and sustainable, and really that research tends to be aligned to the priorities of the country and tends not to fund blue sky research where dreamers can go and dream away and come up with great creative ideas. That feeds into the second kind of funding, which really comes from either philanthropic organizations, development agencies, where they tend to fund the blue sky innovative research that, if successful, if you fund 10 projects, you hope 2 of them at most likely generate revenue, which becomes a self-fulfilling pot. So that funding itself becomes sustainable. So there's 2 kinds of funding that I would, and both previous speakers have mentioned it, but they come from different sources. So I think that's also an important differential. It's unlikely to go to a government to say, we want this kind of funding forever for some really cool new idea we've got, and 2 years later there's nothing to show for it. That tends not to be from government types of funding bases. Generally, I'm generalizing, of course.
Understood. I liked how you pointed out that governments tend to prioritize the needs of the country, whereas philanthropic funders would likely fund your blue sky research projects, as you made reference to that. So in that line, what do you think are the current hindrances to funding for medical research on our continent? Maybe you could pick it up from there, Dr. Gordon.
I think it's evolving. I think if you go back as little as 10 years ago, there were some funders in the world that said, we only fund research, we don't fund infrastructure, we don't fund equipment. And I think a lot of people are realizing that to be in Africa, it's almost counterintuitive, because you've got to invest in infrastructure and research. So I think that's the first key thing is, what is kind of changing? What are the balances? The first thing is the funder's philosophy and understanding what the market is they're investing into. I think it's gotten better, particularly from COVID. But I think before COVID, I think that was it was a significant issue. I think one of the big things that I see a lot in Africa is that many of the funds don't tend to come from Africa. So if I'm talking about South Africa as my home country, you know, I would say about 4 years ago, we did a paper where about 75% of the funding and research in South Africa actually comes from the US and UK governments. So whose priority are we funding in those kinds of areas? Is it theirs or is it ours? And I would probably say today, I would say it's nearly all our priorities, but most of the funding is still coming from outside, and the realization that there's a barrier to get through, and there's a trust and there's a relationship that needs to build. And I think at a practical level, I would think probably the most impactful thing that academia, and I'm talking mostly academia and research groups here, there's a whole lot in terms of grant writing and supporting information and documentation, which tends to count Africa out of the game, because you know, probably the largest funder of research in the world is the National Institute of Health, the US government, and they've got a really rigorous application system. And if you don't have one dot filled in or one box ticked, you're ineligible, even though you may have a good scientific proposal. So it could be things like financial statements, HR records, board CVs, all of these kinds of things that you don't think of when you apply, but there are actually quite significant barriers when you do apply, and lots of institutions don't have that kind of infrastructure in place to support people writing scientific grants with the other aspect. So that's kind of one high level, intermediate level, and one kind of entry level thing that I see that are barriers. I could go on forever, but I think our other colleagues will have different nuances as well.
Mr. Abel, I see you nodding a whole lot. Would you like to give your input?
Thank you so much. And permit me at this stage come from a policy angle. I want to come because that is where I am based, although I am fortunate that I'm also a researcher, but I want to speak from a policy level, because the walls, the pins normally come to government. Why aren't there funds, where, and all that? So I want to have a number of perspectives. The first issue is generally that research is expensive. Generally, research is expensive. And when we are talking in terms of Africa, we should remember that a number of most African countries are low and middle income countries. So, and I'm talking about research being expensive. For you to move your innovation from the ideation stage until it gets to the market. And I can give a simple example, like say a diagnostic kit or a drug or a vaccine or a surveillance tool, for example, it's pretty expensive. That's one hindrance. Nevertheless, however expensive it is, even if we are low and middle income countries, we need to have research get onto our funding list, our funding agenda. So even when it's expensive, we need to have it get a portion of the cake that we cut on the table. So the other limitation and the other barrier is the products of this research and to the population needs. I want you to understand that the policymakers in Africa, they tend to respond and therefore invest where the pressure is mostly coming from. The pressure from civil society, the pressure from the public, where it's coming from. Now, the pressure to governments mostly comes asking where are the roads, where are the good hospitals. I'm talking about the building. They don't talk about research. The public is not asking about research evidence. They're asking about the public. They're asking about the new bridges. They're asking about the railway lines. And so the African leaders and the makers, and they will tend to have their money in the areas where they will point fingers at. So another limitation for research in Africa is the aspect of products. We do a lot, we will publish our work, but the local person, the population and the civil society is waiting to see a good road. So that's another, so the orientation and the interest. The other issue, which is a barrier, is where do scientists put their products? I want to tell you that most of the people who make a decision is to allocate money. They read the national newspapers, for example. But most scientists, when they are given a grant, even if it's for $2,000 and they have a product out of that grant, the first place they will think about is how to send it to Lancet, how to send it to Springer Nature, how to send it to the other good journal. So, and these policymakers don't have time to go to Lancet journals. So the policymakers end up not seeing the value for money. So that's another very big gap as far as funding is concerned. The other aspect, which is critical, that generally the population in Africa, they haven't fully embraced the value for research to inform day-to-day activities. They haven't yet embraced it. And so they won't advocate for it so much. And that's another very big gap that I want to point out. I want to stop at that for now.
Thank you for highlighting that our everyday lives aren't, well, they are linked to research, but maybe most of our populations are not aware or haven't really been sensitized to the idea that research has a bearing on our everyday livelihood. Let's hear your comments, Professor Biemba, on the same.
Thank you so much, Namunji. I think Gordon and Ebo have ably actually tackled this this question on the hindrances or the challenges that face us as far as predictable financing is concerned. I like their approach, but I just want to add also more from the policy perspective, because I also come from the policy perspective. I run the National Health Research Authority, which is basically coordinator of all research activities in the country. That's in Zambia. I think for me, one is lack of prioritization of research, which Abel has touched on. From the policymakers, they have competing priorities. They have to choose from the little funds that they have, whether that money should go to buy drugs, whether that money should go to buy, insecticide-treated nets to prevent malaria, or they should put that money for research for which the results or the outcomes are long, they're not short-term, they're long-term, and they don't see them. So lack of prioritization of research is one of the key hindrances to funding. I'm talking about funding from government, because again, like I said, sustainable funding is making sure that funds are available and accessible for priority research on a continuing basis. That means that for me, government funding is sustainable funding. Second hindrance is inadequate or lack of research priorities or a functioning national health research system. That for me is key. Because if there's no platform, for example, for government, if there's nothing in the policy of government to fund research, it cannot fund research because it has to be budgeted for. Parliament has to allocate funds for research. If there's nothing in the policy, if there's nothing in the regulatory system, that means that government cannot fund research. So that's a key bottleneck as far as I'm concerned. Thirdly, it's on the side of us. Now, if I may just flip the coin now as a researcher myself, I don't think we're doing enough in terms of advocating and lobbying for research funding. I think that is a hindrance in itself. We are used to just going on you know, NIH website or any of these funding agencies, and we look for RFAs, requests for applications, and we apply. But that may not be sustainable in the long run. The last item that or hindrance that I would want to point at is inadequate in-country resource mobilization capacities. Now, we have all these funding agencies, whether they are philanthropies, whether they are government agencies like USAID, especially NIH in terms of research funding, and you know, the EU, EDCTP, many other funding agencies are out there. But to access those funds, as Ebo said, the funding might be there, but accessing it. To access those funds, you need to have the capacity to write grants. And in Africa, especially in my own country, in Zambia, we have a challenge in terms of resource mobilization capacity or grant writing capacities. That's another hindrance in itself. So for me, those are some of the things that are a hindrance to sustainable financing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Biemba. So I do have a follow-up question as well, but I see in the chat, Solomon has made a comment that Richard can hopefully respond to. So just for the benefit of the rest of our audience, the question says, sustainable funding should be locally initiated. Commitments should be made by LMIC countries. We should stop relying solely on etc. We know our local / contextual problems. We shouldn't rely only on outside funders who may have their own research interests not in line with local needs. Richard, I see you've said you can respond.
Yeah. So my answer to the question is, in an ideal world, I think that is first prize. And I couldn't agree with that comment more. I don't think we live in an ideal world, though. And I think the best we can do is to make sure when we collaborate with people like NIH or Wellcome that you mentioned, that when we do collaborate, we collaborate on our terms for our priorities. I think that's a close second prize. I think the reality is, if you're going to many countries in Africa and you're asking them to carve out money for research and innovation, which is what I think we're all wanting, the reality is got to come from somewhere. So it's going to come from the education budget, the health budget, and different countries have different priorities. So, so one of the big questions when you come to lots of international collaborators said, well, do you have funding to put into the pot? We don't have development funding like most European countries where they have their different development fund agencies. So it's got to come from a line item. And I think, as Prof. Godfrey mentioned earlier on, it's got to be budgeted for in a 3 to 5 year cycle. So a very, very good comment. I couldn't agree with it more, but I think the practical reality is kind of where it gets in the way.
Great, thank you for that, and yeah, thank you to Solomon for the question there, and a reminder to. Oh yeah, Abel, would you like to comment?
Just a small comment. I am in agreement with what my colleague has mentioned, but also my colleague Solomon Wafula has mentioned. Just want to give an experience that external funders have made attempts to kind of initiate and keep us going into that direction. For example, you'll get a big grant which is covering, for example, 90% of the research costs for 5 years, and they are saying government, for example, can you contribute 10% of this 90%? And somehow, somewhere, in most cases, even government fails to raise the 10%. So I just wanted to bring, in agreement with my colleague I just mentioned, in the ideal world, it's really a challenge. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. All right, well, actually, I think that builds maybe, or is a good segue into my follow-up question that I was curious about. And this is also maybe from a slightly naive perspective. But the one thing that's come up, and this actually came up in Professor Biemba's definition at the beginning, is that he mentioned priority research. And since then, we've spoken a lot about return on investment and the different priorities of the different funding organizations. And so it seems to me like there is the government's priorities, and then there's philanthropic organizations' priorities. where the governments are going to be a little bit more pragmatic, but probably slightly on the safer side as far as the research is concerned. And then you get the philanthropic organizations who fund the blue sky research that might be a little bit more radical. It seems to me, however, that there is the potential that this is going to crowd out a very particular kind of research. And it's probably going to crowd out something like very radical or exciting new ideas that are in a very specific African context. So, I might use the example of research for a disease like leishmaniasis, which is very African-centric. And if there is any sorts of research that might be super beneficial, it just might not get the funding because it doesn't quite fall into either of the two categories. So I'd like to get the audience's perspective on, how big of a problem this is, how much of the research is kind of falling to this third category that I'm describing that will through the gaps. Maybe Professor Biemba, would you care to go first?
Yeah, so you are right, Yvonne. I can't agree more. But I think the issue is, what do we do with that scenario? The scenario is that any donor or any funding agencies will prioritize what they think is a priority to them. So if they think that leishmaniasis is not a priority to them, then they won't fund it. But also, funders will fund things that they think they will also benefit from. So if you have a pharmaceutical industry, a pharmaceutical company, they will fund a particular research in an area that they think that once that drug or that health technology is marketed, they'll be able to have a return on investment. So we can't blame them. That's basically what it is. But the question is, what do we do? I think for me, that's where countries, including Africa, should really make sure that they focus on health systems, health research systems. Now, I've emphasized the national health research systems. Why? Because within those national health research systems, you define your priorities, you define your funding mechanisms, you define how you are going to coordinate, and so on and so forth. Meaning that whoever is funding research, you will be able to advocate that they fund the kind of research that would have a difference in terms of the health of the people. So if it's Africa, it means bodies like the African Union, Africa CDC, and all other funders, bodies that are concerned with health will be able to come up with priorities where they'll be able to advocate for those priorities to be funded as far as research is concerned. But if there's no framework from which you can lobby or advocate, it's a problem. Then it means that people will just fund what they think it should be funded. So there's need for a lot of advocacy, but that advocacy should be grounded on a system, and that's the National Health Research System. Now, I'm talking about the National Health Research System because it's not just Zambia that is talking about this. The World Health Organization came up with the Research for Health strategy. And within that Research for Health strategy, WHO has emphasized to all member states help resilient national health research systems. It is only from that backdrop that we will be able to convince the different funders to fund what we think is priority research. So for me, that's my submission. We cannot avoid a situation whereby a particular funder prefers to fund certain types of research. That we can't, but we can persuade them based on what we have laid down as our policies and our systems. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor. So I see we're getting a couple of questions in the chat, but just before we move on to those, Abel or Richard, would you like to comment on my question?
Yeah, I can go next, Devon. And my colleague Godfrey has brought it out very clearly. I just want to add on a key point there, that there is need for a national research agenda. I can talk about this several times, but I'm telling you, Devon and my colleagues, a number of African countries do not have a national research agenda. And that means that research investments is scattered, and therefore it can be dominated by and can be dictated by another person from elsewhere. But even therefore it means that even the research output or the output of the research, kind of no one is interested to know what's likely to come out. I want to bring a very clear scenario that in many African countries, you use Uganda as the study, graduate students, I'm about master's students and PhD students, do not have a clear national focus that all of us from Makerere University, from Mbarara University, from which university, we should contribute into that national issue. And so our research questions should be coming from this area, and the research output we give should be informing national policies like ABCD. That is lacking. And Devon, that explains the scenario you are explaining. Now, the second issue is because of that, the international community, the international powers are aware of that, but they are aware of the natural resources within Africa. They are aware of the African population that can contribute for clinical trials. And so they will come and influence, but also front their interests very clearly. So, and I want to tell you something that the person with the money talks, and everyone will listen. The researchers in Africa, the professors in Africa, will affiliate and collaborate with the people who are contributing resources. So if the government is not giving them resources, they will focus on NIH collaborations and UKRI collaborators, and they will pursue those people's agenda against the government's agenda. The government will ignore them, and so they will be in parallel. The researchers are doing this, they produce results, and they publish in Lancet. Government priorities and decisions are made using guesswork, using emotions. So that's how big the problem is. So I'm emphasizing the issue of the national research agenda and a very coordinated way of investing, but also tracking output. In many countries in the UK and US, graduate students make a huge contribution on the national vision, on the national target. For example, if you are going to do a master's in the UK or in the US, which is funded, they will tell you, okay, you're welcome, but your topic is going to contribute on cancer, is going to contribute on this. So because that's where their national targets and priorities are. So Devon, that's my comment on that. We must set up the national agenda, and we deliberately focus there, and we invest in it, and then we track what it is contributing to. Yeah.
So Devon, I'm not going to labor the point because I think both previous speakers really did it well. But the national plans are important for two other reasons. One is there have been several comments in the questions relating to this topic, and a lot of the flavors of the questions are accusing the West of getting benefits out of us. The one thing is we need to organize ourselves first, because what they want to do is come and see a plan. What's the plan that for Uganda or Zambia that we were talking beforehand that we can fund into, and we can fund your priorities? I think it's really important. But also the extra complexity of Africa is, we got more than 50 countries in Africa. So what may be Uganda's priority may not be Cote d'Ivoire's priority. So we can't just picture the whole continent's priorities as being the same. It's at a regional level. So which is why you need your different strategies for the different regions. So, and Prof. Abel was exactly correct. So when I ran the grant funding at the MRC, 70 to 80% of our money went towards TB and HIV vaccine and drug research. It didn't go to cancer. It didn't go to diabetes at that stage, because these are our two, number one and number two in our disease burden, and they get the most funding. So we couldn't fund very, very interesting research projects that were looking at nematodes in Africa. It's important. Worms are important, but they're not as important as the others. So we had to focus the money there, because if you don't, you just dilute the money everywhere, and it actually doesn't make impact.
Absolutely. Before we go to the comments and questions in our Q&A box, I would like to just pick your brains on something that all three of you have mentioned. Basically prioritization and our need for organizing ourselves before we start pinpointing the West on how they may be imposing or may have their own agendas with regards to researchers that they fund. Do you feel we have a gap between the people at the grassroots, or those who actually face challenges when it comes to, say, I'll give an example. Let me give a scenario. In the clinical arena, you have a junior resident or a registrar who sees patients every day, and they're noticing resistance patterns, say, in a particular antibiotic. And do you think there's a gap between them engaging with someone who is potentially going to fund a study to assess why we're having these resistance patterns and the like? Do you think there is a gap between engagement of those who are on the actual front of what's going on the ground in terms of the health system, and those who can actually influence policy and funding?
Who are you asking first, Namuji?
Oh, my bad. We can go with Dr. Richard.
Oh, I was hoping you weren't going to say that. so I mean,
I'll put you on the spot.
It's very country specific. I mean, I don't think we can generalize for Africa. You know, in COVID, I think we were all over any new variants that came out, and everyone who had COVID, or every second person had a sequence done in certain parts of the world. You know, South Africa. And there were several, you know, I know Nigeria, I know Kenya had active genomic surveillance programs going on, which links to the clinician seeing patients. So I don't think we can generalize too much, but I suspect in many countries that is the case. But you know, I think it's very difficult to use the example that you have for a young clinician seeing this. Because then what you end up having is you get distracted very easily from the core mandate. If you're going to pandemic or an epidemic breakout, that's a very different thing. If you're seeing a new strain of gastro that pops up into your hospital, that's probably going to be gone a month later in summer, a new rotavirus or something along those lines. So maybe a difficult example to talk about, but I do think a lot of it stems to organization. And the example that Prof. Abel used a little bit earlier on is some countries are dominated by famous scientists who tend to get the attention and distract away from the national mandate. And you know, somewhere between that and the fully run state-controlled process is the right answer. I neglected to mention what Prof. Biembi mentioned. You know, I do think the Africa CDC is trying to fill this role, and the Africa Union. And you know, if you see how far they've come in the last 2 years, you know, I think there's some optimism there that this can be done. But it's a huge task for a continent of more than 50 countries with one organization trying to put it together. So I don't think it's a simple answer to your question. But in an ideal world, I think that needs to be that would be great. But I don't think that's an Africa thing. I think that's a universal thing.
Thank you for that. Can we hear your perspective, Professor Biemba?
Yes. So I think I would definitely agree with Dr. Richard that it really depends on various situations. In general, I would say that the link between the people on the ground and the research world is actually generally weak. Generally weak in the sense that in most situations, the people that are in the front that is taking care of patients are very preoccupied. They are very busy, and what they want is to take care, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's their mandate. So it's rare that they will think of research questions until they are faced with a particular question and problem, and then they would want to find a solution. And in most cases, those solutions do not lie in actually asking a research question and going ahead with the research, but more in asking the peers and those that are, you know, are experienced in that area, which again, nothing is wrong. So I think that that link, for me, that link needs to be strengthened. The link between those on the ground and those in the research world. Now, I'm saying this because there is a word that is called co-creation. It's a term, co-creation. And the co-creation in knowledge translation in research means that what a researcher is supposed to do is basically to find out what are the main issues that need to be addressed, that require answers. And then the research question is designed together with those on the grassroots. So if you're talking about a policy issue, then the policymakers. If you're talking about a clinical issue, then the clinician. So that when you are designing that study is answering a specific question that is coming from the ground. It's very rare that we as researchers, and I speak for myself, it's very rare that I go to clinicians and say, hey, what are the main problems that you are facing which require research to answer? Very rare that I would do that. In most cases, my research question will arise from either because there's an RFA that has come, NIH or another fund has put up something, so I go there, respond to that RFA. Or out of my own interest, because I'm interested in malaria, I'll just go and basically do a literature search, see where the gap is in knowledge and come up with a research question. So for me, the gap is there. And I think that gap needs to be filled, because only when we are doing research that is answering to real issues on the ground will research be more relevant. Of course, one can argue to say, yeah, research is not just there to answer questions for today. Research is there to answer questions even for tomorrow. So I can do basic research. Fine, that is okay. But really, if we are going to do research that is relevant and that will actually attract funding and that will attract people to see the value of research, then we do need to bridge that gap between the researchers and those that are actually in the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Before we go to Q&A, let's hear your thoughts, Mr. Walakwa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy you've given me a chance to share my perspective on this. And I am in total agreement with you that there is a gap. And my colleagues have highlighted, but I want to bring 3 fronts. The first one, I just want to share with you my experience this evening. I was reading online and I realized that the work I am doing on Rift Valley fever modeling in Uganda and Tanzania, there is an expert at a Food Agriculture Organization Africa level who has been doing some work in that line. So I wrote an email to her. She's a consultant. I said, I want to have a meeting with you. Now, what was I doing? I am trying to engage somebody who has been in the day-to-day running and engagement of Rift Valley fever modeling activities in the African context, because I want to hear them. I want to hear what are those areas they are struggling to address, or what are those areas they have gaps in addressing. The main interest there is for me to make a contribution through my work that will be important to them at a policy making level, which is FAO. Now, I want to tell you that the people, the clinicians, all the people who are doing day-to-day work at the health facility level, at hospital level, they have a number of unanswered questions. I'm telling you, They have so many unanswered questions that are very good for researchers to focus on. The problem, there is no intersection between those people and researchers. It is not there. The time we researchers go to them, we already have a research that we want to interview them on. Go to them when we are designing this project. We don't. We go to them to interview them or to intervene what we have read online or what we have read in a policy brief. But these clinicians, they have a lot to tell us. For example, I want to give you a story. I was recently involved in a malaria mentorship program in one of the districts in Uganda. And I was answering another question. And the clinician told me, oh, thank you for coming. I've been lacking who to tell these things. But there is growing resistance on ABCD. But we don't have any information about it. Can you take it on and you maybe provide the answers? Okay. People to research about this and give us a policy guide on ABCD. For me, that showed me how much and how deep the gap is. The second aspect is data access. You asked a question that this data which the clinicians and which health professionals are generating, which are what the research questions. Do researchers have access to this data? I am telling you, accessing data in African setting is a nightmare. Even when you want to do analysis to show the gaps or to bring areas that need to be teased further, accessing that data is a nightmare. And I'm giving a perspective from Ugandan setting and also other areas we have tried to do research in. Now, when you deny access to data to researchers, they struggle to understand how best to help you, how best to address the standing gap that you have. So access to data is a big issue, and I want to amuse you. As a citizen from Africa is struggling to access health information data, the partner in the US and UK has a free access to it. And so the partner in the UK has a better understanding of the trends of malaria in East Africa than you, a citizen of Africa, because you're limited. You don't have access to that data. The other issue I want to bring is the issue of synergy. The issue of synergy, and it goes back to the research agenda, which we have already emphasized. I have met researchers, this one is doing this particular topic, but in this small area, but they are from the same school or the same department, for example. And this one's also designing the same study area. So the researchers don't come together to discuss what they are planning. And in so doing, there is duplication of efforts. Remember, the resources are minimal. But there is duplication of the efforts. There is no synergy. And that's a very big issue that we need to address head on. Yeah.
And Abel, I'll add one other thing. You can't compare data as well. If you don't synergize, you can't compare data, and both studies you lose that benefit.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I mean, thank you to our panel for all of your answers on this question. So I am cognizant that we have about 5 to 10 minutes left, and I do want to give the panelists an opportunity to say their own final comments. So I'm going to try and summarize the kind of main points being asked about in the chat. And if I misrepresent anyone's questions here, please feel free to quickly shoot a correction in. But for example, I think Hattie says, in a world where African governments do start to offer a budget for research funding, what should a purpose-driven and health research ecosystem look like in Africa? An anonymous attendee says, does the uncertainty from ethics committees contribute to slow research? Martin says, what is the current impact of institutional research bodies in influencing policymakers? So I think that the common thread here, and maybe this is the big question, so perhaps I'm being a little bit ambitious just asking it this way, but I think we've addressed or found the gap that needs to be filled in this conversation so far. And you point out synergy and things like that. So as a very ambitious question. What is the first steps that we need to now start to take out this, this health research ecosystem we've been discussing? I think there's definitely a role of government. There's obviously a role of government in it and of researchers, but we've also pointed out that clinicians need to be involved. I would hope that an organization like One Day Africa would be involved somewhere in there and can play a role. So, what are the first steps towards actually now addressing this gap? Abel, you just raised your hands. I think you can take it up first.
Thank you so much. Permit me to share a best example which we can amplify to other African countries. In Uganda, the head of state is very passionate about research and about discovery and innovations. So there is political will. I'm trying to give what we need to do. There is political will. And so because of that, there is an established agency called Science, Technology and Innovation Secretariat. Its main aim is to develop products that will be resourceful to medical, to agriculture and other areas. Now, setting up that entity responsible, like now the one in Zambia, which my colleague is heading, that's a great step forward. The other thing the government of Uganda has done on the national budget, they have put up what we call an innovation fund. That innovation fund is growing year and year. That innovation fund comes on an annual basis to scientists. And as the last time I checked, it has now grown up to 1.7 million US dollars. And it is annual. So that is a great best practice that we can amplify to other African countries. The other thing I want to share with you is that recently I was part of the national level team that is trying to develop what we call the Pathogen Economy Strategic Plan 2022. We are trying to visualize the health needs of Uganda and Africa 10 years from now, such that we begin informing our actions. So I think visualizing the future and narrowing down where the policy investment should go is another thing that we need to do moving forward. I also want to uplift and thank the Africa CDC. They have come up with what they have called a partnership for African vaccine manufacturing framework. That kind of framework that is bringing together African countries and try to mobilize resources and lobby advocate for resources as African CDC for African needs or for African vaccine development. I think it's a great step in the right direction. Lastly, I want to also talk about the African Population and Health Research Center. I've just been reading about it, where they've tried to put together think tanks at African level to keep thinking, to keep bringing ideas to shape African medical research. I think those are positives that we need to begin off with as we go in the right direction. Over.
Great, thank you, Awol. Richard, I believe you have a hard stop on the hours, so would you like to go next and maybe just wrap in some closing remarks?
Yeah, as well? So I have load shedding in South Africa, so my electricity is going to go off sometime in the next 5 minutes, so I'll be very brief. Look, I've really enjoyed this panel, and I think a lot of the key messages about strategy and national plans, and Prof. Abel's had some really great examples, and Prof. Biemba. I think the 2 points I will make in kind of wrapping up, the first one is that politicians come and go, and presidents come and go. So and the timelines we are thinking about building an ecosystem and changing policy and practice often extend beyond the terms of governments and presidents. So this needs to be done at a top-down state level with a 10-year, 15, 20-year horizon, and can't change every 2 years. whether it's in governments in Africa, the same thing applies in the US. You know, when Trump was in presidency in the US, the whole NIH funding, so it's the world round. And if you look at the pharma sector, they change their CEOs every 3 to 4 years, and then their strategies change. So the world is constantly changing. And what civil society can do is to keep everyone accountable in the system and remind them what is up. The other one is Prof. Abel mentioned a couple of examples. You know, I started a unit at the MRC in 2013 where we had about $1.5 million a year seed funding. And the model that works very well in Africa, and a lot of the global funders really seem to like, is when countries have their skin in the game. If Uganda or Nigeria or Tanzania or whoever puts $10 million into a pot over on understanding that someone is going to match it, but match it ethically, where it's not a 1-to-1 match, it's a 5-to-1 match, and you make a $60 million pot. That is the way we did it. So by the end of I finished my time there, we put $20 million or $15 million, I should say, out of the unit in a calendar year based on leverage funding. And I think that's the model that's going to happen very well. And I think the African CDC is doing that very nicely. But at a country level and at an institution level, I think that is a model that is often overlooked. You know, the history of Africa as it is, there are still a lot of opportunities that we can explore. We want to be self-sufficient, but it's going to be time until we are self-sufficient. And there are clever financing ways that we can try and use to the benefit. So I'm hugely optimistic. I'm not a Afro-pessimist. I'm passionate about the future. And I've learned about somebody else who's working in Rift Valley fever, who I've been trying to get in contact, who I didn't know was in the field. So I know what I'm following up afterwards, because I'm looking for people to collaborate in that area.
Fantastic. Sorry, just to check, you called that leverage funding, that model?
Yes. So the idea is, you know, I think people realize, you know, if I talk in South African currency, you know, if we put R1 million in, you know, the buying power of R1 million is not as much as $1 million. But if the model is that you can't expect everyone to just give you money and we trust us to use it. If you want to raise significantly large sums of funding, if you put your own money in, whether it's philanthropies in your country, whether it's your government, whether it's science councils or governments carving out sections of budgets that can be matched ×3, you have control, you have leverage, you have negotiation power in these kind of relationships. So for a very simple example, in my first year, we basically got a $10 million, $12 million grant from a large philanthropic funder. We put in $3 million as a leverage, as a kind of a match. And we made a pot of $13 million. So that's how we started it. So I think that kind of model is becoming more popular, that African countries have this skin in the game where you are at the table, where decisions are made. It's your priorities you are working on. And you are in control of the research agenda. And I think that's the model Africa is moving more and more towards.
Great. Thank you for that. And, you know, before your power goes out, thank you again for sitting on this panel. And we've really valued your input.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Prof. Bieber, would you like to just answer the question briefly? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would actually, because there are many, but I just wanted to summarize my thoughts on this. Number one is that I was saying that we need to utilize bodies like CDC, Africa CDC, AU, to be able to make sure that we have policies that are sustainable or support sustainable financing for research. I need to be clear on that one because I know that Africa CDC actually has a thematic area on research. So I just wanted to underscore that. But number two is that for us to strengthen these national ecosystems, the steps that my colleague has put are definitely what we went through as Zambia. We have a very, very robust national health research system. We started with a situation analysis. So we basically did a situation analysis of the research landscape in the country. And then from there, we were able to identify where the gaps are. From there, we developed a national health research policy. From there, we developed a national health research agenda. We developed the a coordinating mechanism, which the National Health Research Authority. We developed the legal framework, which is there. And I can assure you, just like my colleague from Uganda, the Zambian government has a lot of priority we have on research. So we have political will, very much political will, at the level of the president himself. The first speech that the president gave emphasized government support for research. That is a must. If we don't have political will, if a country doesn't have political will, it cannot really have sustainable financing. I don't know if I have time. I know that time is gone, but I have seen a number of questions in there. The impact of institutional research bodies influencing policymakers. What's the current impact? The impact is there, definitely. It really depends on how strong those research institutional bodies are. In my country, we have a number of institutional bodies, research institutions themselves. They are doing a lot in terms of influencing policy, and they can do more. What would you say about the presence of neglected tropical diseases? I think we answered that question, that the reluctance of funding or from external donors on these neglected tropical diseases is really dependent on which donor you're talking about, because there are donors that are actually focusing on neglected tropical diseases, but we cannot force them to a particular donor to fund something that they don't prioritize. Our politicians in Africa are the ones that have created the problem. I'm not sure if that is true, because we do have a lot of politicians that have really research at their heart, like Zambia, for example. So I don't think that is totally true, that politicians have created the problem. I don't think we have enough time, but I just want to say one last thing, that institutionalization of research is key to sustainable funding. By institutionalization, I mean that research should be part and parcel of the national health research, the national health system. If it's not part and parcel of the national health system or a regional body's agenda, then it means that it will be a by the way. And many times there's not sustainable financing because research is done as a by the way. But we need to realize that research is part of the national health system and must be taken as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your final words, Professor. Do we have any final words from you, Mr. Walekwa?
Yes, I do, and I want to thank you so much. First of all, I'm going to answer a question which was addressed to me, but I just want to also share another experience which is working in Uganda. In Uganda, what we have done through science, technology, and innovation, which is a coordinating center for research, which is aimed at product development to support other ministries and other entities, we have deliberately put scientists to begin working together. So we said, okay, if this scientist is doing on molecular work and is this university, this university, this university, this university, they didn't know each other. So when COVID came, we deliberately put them together so they are collaborating. And because of that, they are sharing infrastructure. They are sharing the small money which is there. And there is now synergetic effort towards one direction. And instead of the same person doing the same study on malaria in this university, the other university, but now they are working together so they can say, okay, now all of us, let's put our energy and our expertise in this one area. That's one thing I wanted to highlight. The other issue is what we call national think tanks. We have also initiated national think tanks to research on which health issues to focus our resources and our investment on. And I think that is taking us forward. Now, the CDC, Africa CDC vaccine manufacturing agenda 2063 is clear. It is focusing on three things: vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics, which are the testing kits. It's missing a very important point of transboundary disease surveillance. Diseases don't know borders. And as we go forward, There is emerging and re-emerging diseases. The conversation of disease surveillance, early warning, early detection, forecasting should come on table, and I want to bring it here. The second point I want to emphasize is the teaching of medical research in higher institutions of learning. It is something that we have not touched on since we began our conversation, but as we are talking about building capacity, which Professor Biemba emphasized, the issue of capacity building and teaching of medical research is a critical thing. In undergraduate training, it is not overemphasized, and I think we should begin emphasizing it, and we should even begin having it go into high school. I want to respond to my colleague's question that he asked. Do we think politicians are a cause to lack of funding, or we have answered that already? We have realized that it comes from all corners, but I want to bring the issues that can block funding from the government perspective. One, the issue of corruption. I cannot shy away from talking about corruption because you will allocate resources to researchers and there will be no value, there will be no accountability. So corruption is common and it's a hindrance, and I'm talking from, and it is more into the public sector and the government is that unknown attendee who asked that question. The second point we also bring from the government issue, which could be blocking funding, is the procurement delays. I want to tell you that you can order for a testing kit or an infrastructure, and it will take years and years and years. And before you realize the funding time is over, when you haven't even received the equipment that you ordered 2 years ago. So the procurement delays, it is another issue from government angle, which delays funding. The other issue I want to bring, and I want to hint about it, is the intellectual property protection. The issue of patenting the novel ideas, novel biological ideas, is something that African countries are blocked as we speak today by virtue of the TRIPS agreement. And of course, African CDC should begin pursuing that. Until we make African researchers to begin patenting their products, then we won't get benefits from the novel discoveries, and we won't make a breakthrough. So that is another gap I want to agree with, that is colleague who raised that point. Over, and I want to thank you so much for this audience to share my thoughts on this topic.
Thank you so much, Mr. Walekwa. So take-home message from majority of our discussion this evening is that sustainable funding for research is a multidimensional or multifactorial issue. It doesn't stand alone in terms of government funding or external funding. It's also based on political will, institutionalization of research, like you mentioned, the need for think tanks, bridging the gap between the grassroots and policy makers, leveraging in terms of our financial options on the continent or at local and regional level, and the like. So I would like to say a big thank you to our panelists tonight. It's unfortunate that Dr. Gordon is no longer with us, but we'd like to say a big thank you on behalf of the One Day Africa team to Professor Godfrey Biemba, Mr. Abel Walekwa, and Dr. Gordon, who's now in absentia, for all your time and effort. I believe this has been a very enlightening discussion. Maybe we even need to do a part 2. And we're glad that we could have potential collaborations between the South African Medical Research Council and Office of the President of Uganda from this discussion. And we look forward to more discussions such as this one. We'd also like to thank all our attendees. Thank you so much, audience, for keeping us engaged with your running commentary and your questions. Feel free to follow all our social media platforms for the One Day Africa. So that's One Day Africa on Facebook, as well as on Twitter and on Instagram. We do have a quarterly newsletter, and we will be publishing content based on some of the discussions we've had in this very event and this very evening. So without further ado, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for attending this event, and we hope you have a pleasant weekend.